Let us pray. May the words of my mouth, meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Welcome to Transfiguration Sunday. Some of you may be very familiar with Transfiguration Sunday if you grew up in certain churches, and others of you may never have heard of it. So if you've never heard of it, Transfiguration Sunday is the Sunday that is like the hinge. It's the hinge Sunday between the season of Epiphany, which we have been in since the beginning of January, the season of light, the season when we celebrate the revelation of God in Jesus, and the season that begins on Wednesday, the season of Lent, the season when we turn our faces towards Jerusalem and the cross that waits for Jesus. And we begin to walk with Jesus towards the darkness that he faces. We journey alongside him towards the cross. So on this Hinge Sunday, we always read one of the stories of the Gospels that tells of Jesus' transfiguration on the Mount, the one you just heard from Matthew. It's also in Mark and Luke. Well, this story comes immediately after Jesus' first attempt to explain to his disciples that they may not have caught on to this yet, but things are not exactly going to turn out the way they might have thought. That he actually has a destiny which they have not foreseen, and that he is going to be beginning to head towards Jerusalem, where he will be put to death. Not a message they were ready to hear. So it's no wonder they become totally confused. Because immediately after Jesus first predicts his death in Jerusalem, he takes Peter and James and John up onto the mountain, and we get this story where Jesus is transfigured, becomes shining and bright as the sun, and they're nearly blinded by the light of it. And here they receive what you might call the down payment on the resurrection, the glory that is to come following that terrible event of crucifixion. And so it's all here right in this hinge part of the Gospels where there's this turning point. If you think of literature, there's always that climax moment, and then there's a turning point in the plot. And we have this turning point where Jesus has been doing the work of the life of ministry, down in the trenches with the people, healing, feeding, being present with them, and raising hopes that this is indeed the Messiah that was promised, the one who will restore the glory of the lost kingdom of Israel. And then they hear this unwelcome prophecy that in fact the journey will lead to darkness, crucifixion, and death. Darkness and light, despair and ecstasy. They reside cheek by jowl in these gospel stories. And there's a message for us in this if we have the ears to hear it. Dante Alighieri's epic medieval poem, The Divine Comedy, you may be more familiar with its most famous book called The Inferno, begins with these words. In the middle of the journey of my life, I came to myself in a dark wood where the direct way was lost. It is a hard thing to speak of, how wild, harsh, and impenetrable that wood was, so that thinking of it recreates the fear. It's scarcely less bitter than death. But in order to tell of the good that I found there, I must tell of the other things I saw. So as we pivot from Transfiguration into Lent this year, we're going to follow the thread of a unifying theme for much of our Lenten journey. And it's a theme that's based in this book from which we drew our modern testimony for today, The Gifts of the Dark Wood by Eric Elnes. And I invite you, if you are interested, since we will be having a sermon series on this theme, you might want to get the book, you might want to get it out of the library, you might want to look for it and read it. And maybe we'll find a time to get together and talk about it if you're interested. So next Sunday, we're going to be privileged to hear Dr. Sheldon Hurst bring the message, culminating his series that we've been going through on the 7 deadly sins. But the week after that, I'm going to be starting this sermon series on the gifts of darkness. And so Elnes, in his book, The Gifts of the Dark Wood, he picks up this metaphor from Dante, and he finds it to be a golden thread that runs through what we might call mystical Christianity. The Christianity of the great mystics, Meister Eckhart, St. John of the Cross, who talked of the dark night of the soul. The anonymous writer of The Cloud of Unknowing, a classic in the mystics. And all of these mystical writers talk about a foreboding place, a place where we are enshrouded in darkness that turns out to be a place where we can find strange and wondrous spiritual gifts, much to our surprise. In fact, Elnes makes the striking claim that the dark wood is where you meet God. Now, it is ironic to bring in the theme of darkness on Transfiguration Sunday, which is usually all about light. Because as I said, Transfiguration Sunday is the culmination of Epiphany, the season of light. And on the mountaintop, as we heard, Jesus' identity as God's beloved child is revealed in this shining moment by a mysterious voice which booms out, "This is my beloved child with whom I am well pleased." So on this Sunday of all Sunday, why introduce the talk of darkness, of losing one's way? Well, that's why I wanted to talk about this idea of the place where darkness and light meet. You know, as I do, that yin cannot exist without yang, that night cannot exist without day, that without darkness we probably would never have a chance to even know what light is. Isn't it the brightest sun that casts the darkest shadow? So at times, we might say that our mountaintop experiences, our brightest moments, are actually a preparation for longer sojourns in the darkness of the valleys of life and struggle and the everydayness of the world. So as we prepare for Lent, I want to invite you to open up your hearts and minds to these gifts of the dark wood. Together, as we chart our way through Lent, we will be seeing life through some new and fresh lenses. And as Elnes writes, we'll be recognizing that experiences of failure, experiences of emptiness and uncertainty are as critical for living the good life, for finding our way through life, as they are unavoidable. They're unavoidable. And I hope that you'll see that these experiences in what Dante called the dark wood are clues, or they can be clues, to how to find and live out our true calling, our vocation in this world. And what is true for individuals can apply to groups as well, even congregations. The interim period, which we are now in at First Congregational Church, the interim period in a church's life can be a liminal space, a thin place. It can be a space where we straddle two worlds. The world of the congregation that has been, and the world of the congregation that will be coming into being. At times, as we enter this and reside in this liminal space, it may feel that we're a little bit lost, wandering in that dark wood. And it can be so tempting to fight that feeling, to deny it, or try to just get through it as fast as we can. But this Lent, I want to issue an invitation. I want to invite you and all of us to try out embracing the dark. Embracing it as the place where an unexpected light may be found. Embracing the darkness in order to find that spiritual awakening which comes through struggle rather than in the absence of struggle. Well, Simon Peter knew about struggle. So I want to talk a little bit about Simon Peter. Of all the disciples, Simon Peter has a unique role in all the Gospels. Well, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As you heard in our first reading, Simon Peter was the first disciple to recognize Jesus as the promised one of God, the Messiah. And immediately after the section we read, you get that famous story where Jesus says, "No longer will you be Simon, but I will call you Peter." Peter, Cephas, which means rock in Greek. Because on this rock, on you, Peter, I will build my church. Wow. That's a heavy burden to bear, isn't it? Well, through this name change, Jesus seems to be elevating Peter to a special position. But here's the thing. Besides Judas, you might say Jesus is the biggest failure in the Gospels as a disciple. It's only Peter in all the Gospels that denies Jesus 3 times as Jesus awaits his crucifixion after his arrest. Peter is a bundle of contradiction, as are we all. And nowhere can we see that better than in the section of Matthew we heard today. Right after Peter aces the quiz, when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" and he gets it right, he wastes no time in just screwing everything up. If nothing else, Peter is certainly as dense as a rock. For right after our story, again, not read, we didn't read it, but right after our story, when Jesus explains that his destiny is to go to Jerusalem, or actually we did read this part. After that story, we hear the part where Peter rebukes Jesus and tries to talk him out of it. Like, no, you can't, don't say these things. Because Peter's thinking, this is crazy. You're the Messiah. Messiahs don't die, okay? It's not the plan. But Jesus, at that moment, sees Peter as not so much the rock on which he'll build his church, but as a stumbling block and sort of a play on words. And he says, you are a stumbling block. Get behind me. And he even refers to him as Satan. Okay, that's a pretty big come down for the star disciple. But this is the guy that Jesus has chosen to build his church on? Well, if you've read the Bible, we shouldn't be surprised. As we know, if we've read the Bible more often than not, God chooses the greatest sinners and the greatest screw-ups to do God's work in the world, which is actually quite hopeful when you think of it. Gives me hope every day. So in Gifts of the Dark Wood, Eric Elnes asked this provocative question. He says, could it be that right failure is more important to Jesus than right belief? Think about that. Is failing rightly, whatever that is, somehow more important to God than believing all the right things and just rolling them off your tongue? Did you memorize them in Sunday school? So often, Elnes claims, Christians seem to feel it's our responsibility to build a church on a firm and unshakable foundation. But Jesus seems to want to build his church on a sinking rock, on a stumbling block. What's that about? Well, the premise of the Gifts of the Dark Wood, which we'll be exploring in Lent, is that sometimes it takes a journey into darkness, as Elnes writes, even deep darkness, to finally awaken to the smallness of our success-based world. Sometimes, he says, you need to lose your way in order to discover the grandeur, the mystery, and the freedom of the world that awaits us. Well, what would it look like if during our interim time together, as we continue on this interim journey, we did something totally counterintuitive? What if we prepared for failure? I know it sounds crazy. But a few years ago, the Reverend John Dorhauer, our current UCC General Minister and President, at the General Synod, when he was elected, said that the church, in order to survive, is going to have to prepare to fail. He said, to prepare to fail gives us permission to take risks. Because it's only when you're willing to take some risks and allow yourself to fail a little that you can ever ultimately get it right. And so he says, give yourself permission to find the innovators and the creators. Give yourself permission to step out over the comfortable ledge and take risks. Because when we fail, we will be received with grace. So, I invite us as we engage in the practices of Lent to take up the challenge of a risk-taking faith that doesn't necessarily bear fruit immediately, but bears the sweetest fruit over the long haul. Sometimes we might feel like we're moving in the wrong direction as we experiment our way through this liminal space. It's easy to lose heart during this time, as Peter did on many occasions. But when we do, like Peter, we can turn to Jesus, to the one who chose to build his church on a stumbling block. And as we acknowledge that we do stumble and we do fail, we will have the humility to come to rest on the rock that holds us, that stabilizes us, that lifts us up and will not fail us. So if we can model for one another the willingness to take risks, to prepare to fail and to brave the dark wood from time to time, we can find the courage to do it in our own lives. And so come to church in Lent and come to our Wednesday evening series that Sheldon and I will be leading. Come on Sunday. Learn about the gifts of the dark wood. Come to find company in your weaknesses and stumblings. Come to know you're loved and chosen and sent out anyway. For it is on our shaky foundation that God chooses to build the church, and on none other. Thanks be to God. Amen.